like to do is to throw it open to the audience. Do we have a mic for the audience? I'm sorry, I just want to check in advance. Okay, we've got a mic for the audience that will be coming around after the first 20 minutes or so. And we'll try and give you as much time for your questions and your comments as possible. And it's such an honor to have both of you here. You know, in different ways, you've been icons for women of my generation, and now you're icons for the generation below. I wanted to start by quoting something from Rebecca Solnit, actually, on the subject of change and why we are so impatient. And she says, the past explodes from time to time, and many events that once seemed to have achieved nothing turn out to do their work slowly. You know, much of what has been most beautifully transformative in recent years has also been branded a failure by people who want their money back. And there's a sense, again, that we must convert the currency of protest immediately into change. And both of you know that this isn't always the way it works, that there's a specific goal to protests, which may or may not be achieved. I was wondering whether we could start with you, Ms. Steinem. Your early memories of protest. What did you see, and now that you're looking back at it over a period of decades, where do you think the change happened? How was it different from what was expected?
I do think that when I started, I was quite naive. And I think in a way, burnout is a function of naivete. You know, you see injustice and you think this is so huge and so obvious that surely if I just explain it, people will want to do something about it. And it took me quite a while to understand the depth of the injustice, to understand that, say, females of the world are the biggest unpaid or underpaid labor source of the world, and a lot of people are making profits from it. That also you have to control reproduction in order to perpetuate racism or caste or class. You know, it really took me quite a while to understand the depth. So my dearest hope today is that maybe we can, together, Ruchira and I can save you some time, because I do think that, or save you burnout, because that kind of flat out all the time effort is not adapted to the long term. And I think, as someone said about the new party, protest is poetry, governance is prose, you know. And there's one other thing I find helpful to remember, which is that the means we use become the ends we get, right? So if we want to have lives and children and love and humor and literature at the end, we have to have lives and humor and love and literature along the way. We need to pace each other. It's possible that female human beings are especially vulnerable to this kind of flat-out exhaustion, because we're so socialized to believe that we need to prove our value by our usefulness to others. And I think the great art form for a lot of us is to understand that the golden rule doesn't work unless you can reverse it. You know, that a smart guy said for other guys, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. But for women, I think we often have to learn to treat ourselves as well as we treat other people.
I'm very glad you came up with this, because one of the things we were thinking about in Delhi after there was a wave of protests last December is the protests went off the media pages. You know, to a certain extent, people stopped covering the marches. They were looking for bigger marches. But what was happening wasn't bigger marches. What was happening was women saying, I think we'd like to change the kind of relationship we have with domestic help, or we'd like more people to help with our chores, or we'd like our relationships to be less abusive, more filled with trust. And in a way, we are going to end up talking a lot about relationships and the transactions that people have with each other. Ruchira, I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about protests that are not seen by the media. in Ruchira's work at Apne Aap and before that in her work as a journalist, what she's covered often is the lives of women and men in a flow. So a protest is not this rousing moment of change. Instead, what happens is something like what happened with Dalit women in the 1990s. They started protesting over water rights. And change started to happen in villages when women started training as pump mechanics. And, training a whole bunch of other women out there. And that in its turn changed the dynamics of how people interacted with each other. When your pump mechanic is a woman who 2 years ago was banned from using water from the village well, there's a lot of shift in power. And Ruchira has seen so much of that on the ground with the work she does, both with trafficking and when you speak to women, the women you work with, they've both taken part in protests, but their work also carries on, the work for change that they do carries on beyond that. And I was wondering whether you'd address that.
I can see a lot of protesters in the audience, so you know that the times that you marched on the streets against the rape, the protest did not end there. That when the police water cannon Kavita or others who were in the march, that was the turning point. Actually, the protest itself became the turning point for a change in consciousness, that we do not want to be water cannon, we do not want to be beaten with sticks when we stand up for what we believe is our right. And something similar happened to me and the women of Apne Aap. And so I just want to share my journey with so many of the students here who are right now on the streets as well, is that, I protested first by writing, because I thought the world is so unfair and the only way I can do it is maybe I can't march on the streets, maybe I will expose what is unfair. And I began to look for those moments of injustice, but also when I was looking for those moments of injustice, I began to look for what was invisible, who was rebelling against that injustice and how. So what Nilanjana mentions takes me back to the time that I remember I went to cover the Roop Cover Sati in Ranchi, and some people told me that actually before she was burnt on the funeral pyre, she had said no. But she couldn't jump out because so many men had surrounded her and were shouting slogans and saying she's a goddess, and she couldn't jump out of the fire. So I wrote about that. There were these 3 women in Kanpur, I remember, who committed suicide because there was no dowry available. 3 sisters, and they were found hanging from the ceiling through a fan. And the protest letter that they left behind, which then became a way for other people to think about dowry. And so, how consciousness changes through one person's protest in their own lives and also other people's lives. The same thing happened on the 16 December rape, was that Jyoti resisted. Her friend resisted the people who were raping, and that's why they were even more beaten up and more brutalized. But that lit a fire, which then other students took on and went out. And while we were protesting in Delhi, I remember that there were men who would say that they would come in front of us, male students and friends, to protect us from the water cannoning and the beatings and all of that. And the women said, no, we don't want to be protected. We want solidarity. We want you to walk side by side with us. So, protest and continuing protest changes, the nature of protest changes. Gloria often says that a child protests at home when she tells her parents, you are not the boss of me, or it's not fair. So protest is in various ways. And inside Apne Aap Women Worldwide, the organization that I founded, just forming Apne Aap Women Worldwide was a protest. Because I was a journalist, I went into the brothels of Bombay, I met women who were so subjugated and exploited that, they couldn't even begin to think about how to protect themselves. And they said, can you help us? And I said, no, you can help yourself. Because when I was making a documentary with them, they had actually protected me from a man who had pulled out a knife on me, saying, we want to tell our story. And they surrounded me, 22 women, and protected me. So I said that, see, you protested against him trying to kill me. You decided you would tell your story. That was the first sign of protest. And therefore, together we can change things around. And that's how Apne Aap was born. And that's why Apne Aap is called Apne Aap. And then inside Apne Aap, what we realized was that to change the system, one thing is, of course, to be able to access government services, because every citizen of India, a woman in a red light district, a Dalit woman, a poor woman in a slum, all of them should have equal access to all the government rights and entitlements. But marginalized communities from denotified criminal tribes, women living in slums and women living in red light areas don't have that access. They are cut off because because of their caste, because of their class, because of their sex. And even if a girl from what is known as a denotified criminal tribe tries to go to school, she might be discriminated against in school. Or if she's pulled out of the school and put into a brothel, the district superintendent of education will not show up to ask where she is, because she is literally that Gandhi's last girl. And by last girl, I mean the person who's the most poor and the most weak, that Gandhiji used to talk about when he said that when we think of any action for change, we must try and imagine the poorest and the weakest person we know. And very often we used to think of him as the man, the Daridra Narayan. And then Devaki Jain, the economist, said, no, it's not the Daridra Narayan, it's his wife, the Daridra Narayani. But through my own work, I found actually it's the Daridra Kishori, who is this last girl, who's the daughter of the poorest and the weakest man. Because along with caste and class and sex, the fourth thing that is used to control her is her age. Nobody respects a girl who's between the ages of 13 and 19. All her decisions are taken for her, who she marries, whether she's prostituted, whether she stays at home, goes to school, and she is the person who needs a voice and access to justice. So in Apni Aap, what we're trying to do is to organize these girls and these women in small groups so that each one has a voice, known as self-empowerment groups, and for them to campaign for their rights, the very rights which they should be entitled to by the government. So to file a report in a police station, to be able to go to court to testify against a trafficker, to be in school and not be pulled out of school. And for each of this, they run campaigns. They go to the school principal and say, admit us. They go to the judge and say, write our complaint.
And this is something that, again, Ms. Steinem's written about repeatedly. Which is the power of small groups, the power of clusters. When you think of protest, often it's the big movement that you think of. Women coming out for slut walks or for Take Back the Night protests, or, in large numbers as they did in Delhi last year and in Calcutta as well. But you were speaking as well of the power of small clusters of women to start talking about their lives and of change coming from there. And one of the things that you write about often is the necessity of retrieving a memory of the past. If you're protesting, what are you protesting for? You're not just protesting for a change in the future. You're saying that our culture was very different in the past. There was a time when it wasn't necessarily like this. In other words, you have to change people's memories. You have to make them realize also what they have to go back to. And I was wondering whether you could open up a little bit about.
No, I'm glad you raised the issue of small groups, because we are communal people. If we're by ourselves for very long, we come to feel isolated, crazy, the system is right, we're wrong, the media is right, we're wrong. We forget that the media is not reality, reality is reality, And if there's anything that I have treasured as something that has enabled me to keep going with strength, frustration, anger, joy, whatever it is, but to keep going, it is having small groups of people, women or men. They may be very, very different, but to kind of share hopes and share values. You hopefully see each other at least once a week, but no less than once a month. It's like an alternate family, because so many of us are not in democratic families necessarily, that we need to make chosen families. And whether it was the so-called speaking bitterness groups, the small groups that started the Chinese Revolution, or whether it was in my country, the civil rights movement, African Americans speaking out in churches in the South, and one person says, this happened to me, and 6 others say, really, it happened to me too. And then you realize that if unique people are having the same experience, it's probably political, and if you get together, you can change it. And certainly the women's movement around the world has come from small groups of women meeting by the well, meeting by the Zambezi River, meeting in the basement of the YWCA, meeting in each other's living rooms, wherever it is, and supporting each other, and being a place where you can speak the truth. And therefore, you can begin to see the patterns of your own life and the patterns around you and keep going. I really, it's hard to emphasize anything that's more important to us as communal animals than having that kind of small group support, and that keeps you going. And then you can have the big demonstrations in which you take over the whole avenue or the whole downtown or whatever it is. But in the small group, you can confess what you don't know. You can ask for advice. People are committed to being honest with each other in a constructive way, and also to keeping what is said in the room within the room. So that it involves a level of trust. It really is an alternate family, and I so hope that we can have this in our lives, because I don't think I think you burn out otherwise. It's also true that we need to, how shall I say, we need to understand that people who have been systematically told they're inferior sometimes internalize, as we call it, internalized oppression. I don't know what you call it, you know, so you feel sometimes you don't get support from your group because your group is somehow saying inside of itself, wait a minute, that's just another X like me. Who does she think she is, or he is? So it isn't that the support is perfect, but that we understand that no system of oppression works without internalized oppression or self-hatred, and that we try to get out of it in any way that we can, including learning about the real past. I mean, I think it dawned on me, because I was a student here so long ago, that when I was in Miranda House at the University of Delhi, I wanted to learn about India, and the courses were still all about England, you know. Yes. So, so it dawned on me, wait a minute, you know, what have I been learning at home? You know, how come all my courses in college were about Europe? How come I never learned about Africa and Latin America and Asia, except for one half-semester course on India? How come there was one sentence that said women were given the vote? How come, you know, I mean, a lot of education is a brainwashing. It's not an education. So all the more reason we need to speak to each other as if everyone counted.
A question really for both of you, but perhaps Ruchira would like to take this, you know, part of it first. When you look at young women from whatever background they come from, for most of us, there's been a 20-year to 30-year evolution in the sense of learning, you know, reclaiming a certain sense of the past, as you said, whether that sense is of women as a whole, or whether it's understanding what really happens in your families, in your relationships, in your workplaces, unpacking those structures. And particularly with the women you work with, the younger women, is there any way that you use to short-circuit that process? Is just sharing their own stories powerful enough for women to see patterns? Or where have you seen the most change? I mean, how do you speed up change in that sense? Do you even want to?
That's a really interesting question, because, you know, I work with so many different kinds of women. There are women who are in the red light districts. There are their daughters who are in the red light districts. Then I have interns who come to work with Apne Aap, who are in colleges, and some of them from very elite colleges. And I have also students where I teach at NYU who are from different kinds of background. Like one student I had, her sister was still in on social welfare. Another student who had got trapped in the porn industry, and she became an NYU student. So I have a variety of young women now that I increasingly come in contact with. And I think one of the ways I most connect with, and this is something I learned from Gloria a long time ago, was that telling my own story, my own struggles with injustice and inequality, and very specific stories, not as jargon, not as long sentences, but how I resisted my own uncle when I found out he was a pedophile, or abusing someone in my family, or how I stood up to a political leader who was organizing the destruction of a mosque, and his followers tried to throttle me to death. and how I try to report about it and how I faced off the backlash against it, or sometimes even talking about the friendships that I have with other women, you know, that I have 2 best friends from school. We were friends from age 4 to whenever, and how we used to rebel against things in school or college. And even the friendship that I share with Gloria, you know, which cuts across countries and generations, and how we try to do things together. So I always try to share my personal stories, and if I'm truthful, then I notice the connect, and you know, the women see that there is something they can also do.
I know you've written about this, but again, some of the women in your life whom you ended up learning from, you know, learning from their histories, but you were going to say something else.
No, I was just going to say that you know, the secret is just to start where you are, you know. I mean, if you're an old person like me and you're going to a meeting that young people don't have access to, take a young person with you. If you're a young person and old people don't get to hear this kind of music or poetry or whatever it is, take an old person with you. Try to never have a group more than 2 people that is exactly the same, you know what I mean? Try to represent different classes, ages, races, castes, you know, whatever represents the true diversity that is affected by the problem. And, you know, it's just sort of, it's not rocket science, it's kind of common sense. You know, if you come from a dominant group, you probably talk more than you listen, so try to balance it. If you come from a non-dominant group, you probably listen more than you talk, so try to talk more. Just, you know, in what you do every day, because it is